Hey dude and dudettes, it's me, H. Ivans, and this is another edition, a special edition of the Radical Reset video podcast. Today I want to talk to you about surviving the post-pandemic or the next round of the pandemic, depending on what comes out. Now, in the introduction to this podcast, I posted below a quote from the Wall Street Journal, a very recent article by a man named Paul Singer, who's one of the great financial geniuses of the last 30 or 40 years. I just want to read it to you again in case you didn't read it before we came into the podcast so that you understand the basis where I'm coming from. Now there is a completely new emergency, and at this moment, the emergency monetary policy is completely inappropriate. But we want to remind people of a few truths. On form, we think it is very unlikely that central bankers will move to normalize monetary policy after the current emergency is over. They did not normalize last time, and the world has moved demonstrably closer to a tipping point, after which money printing, prices, and the growth of debt are in an upward spiral that the monetary authorities realize cannot be broken except at a cost of a deep recession and credit collapse. The point worth making is that credit collapse, though terrible, is not as terrible as hyperinflation in terms of destruction wrought upon societies. Capitalism, which is economic freedom, can survive a credit crisis. We don't think it can survive hyperinflation. We think there are a number of really good reasons to stringently try to protect the purchasing power and trustworthiness of fiat money, especially the primary reserve currency, the almighty dollar. But chief among those reasons is to keep a good distance away from the tipping point in which confidence is destroyed. That's from April the 21st, 2020, the Wall Street Journal. Pardon me for reading from it and not being able to memorize it, but I'm 62 years old. I'll be 63 May the 14th. But anyway, okay, so what is Paul Singer saying? He's saying what I've been saying all along. He's saying what I said in a Radical Reset. He's just confirming it. And I hope this gives you an idea of how serious this is. Paul Singer is one of the major money managers in the world today. He manages billions and billions of dollars of real money. And what he's saying to you is that the fiat currency, which is the fancy way for saying printing up the dollar out of thin air and all the other currencies that are backed by the dollar, is an enormous danger. And it's going to be almost impossible to turn off the tap once it's turned on, and it's on. That's what all these trillions of dollars in stimulus are. And it could lead to a credit collapse, and B, a hyperinflation. And I think it's going to lead to both. So in this podcast, I'm going to give you a 3-step plan to protect yourself, because there's very little that you as an individual can do, or that I as an individual can do, to stop the greater problem. If there was an anti-political political system, and that's what we're all working for, that's what I hope that you join me in doing. But for the meantime, that doesn't exist. There's only politics as usual. And until there's an anti-political system, you and I are going to have to deal with things as they are, not as we wish they would be. And so now I want to give you 3 steps that are thinking outside the box, way outside the box in some cases. Some of you may think I'm even a little nutty. But as you can see, not as nutty as you may have thought before, because there are a lot of people, and even the mainstream, who see the disaster coming. Okay, 3 steps. No particular order. Step number 1, and I know this is going to run contrary to what you're reading in the papers these days, because I'm seeing the same stories that you are about, and you know, the financial advice stuff that you read like in Money Magazine or in any number of places around, you know, Susie Orman and all the rest, or Dave Ramsey, they're all well-intentioned and they're all nice people and they're all trying to give you good advice, but they're all dealing from a very traditional standard playbook. And so they're all going back to that playbook because that's all they know. And thinking outside the box is dangerous, because if you're wrong and you're in a position like Susie Orman or Dave Ramsey, then you're going to be massively wrong and risk losing your audience. So rather than risk that, they would rather be wrong in the sense that they're wrong with all the other conventional thinkers, so that their excuse can always be, well, everyone else was wrong too. But I don't suffer from that problem, so I'm going to go ahead and give you advice that's way, way outside of what Dave or what Susie would give you, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Okay, so here we go. Step number 1. no matter what your credit is, expand your available credit as quickly as possible now. Now, let me explain what that means. I don't know what your credit score is. I can't possibly know. I hope it's over 700, and I hope it's good, and I hope you have access to extensive credit. But even if it's damaged, there's credit available to you, and you should line it up in advance right now. Now, when I say line it up, I don't mean take it. In other words, I'm saying get as many credit cards as you can. And I know this is 180 degrees the opposite. Just follow with my logic, but of what people would tell you. Get all the credit cards you can. Get all the credit lines you can. Go to the bank if you have real estate equity and set up a credit line. Set up as much available credit as you possibly can, but don't take it. Set it up as a reserve. Now, why am I saying to do that? Two reasons. Number one, the conventional wisdom is that you should always have 90 days of your income in cash in the bank. But we all know as a result of this disaster, almost nobody had 90 days of their income in cash in the bank, and that's why the government rushed to come to the market with all the stimulus money and the enhanced unemployment benefits, which are a disincentive to work, but that's a topic for another day. Basically, most people are living hand to mouth. But what you can do is expand your availability of credit. And if you still have decent credit, or even average credit, or even marginally decent credit, no matter what the interest rate on the credit card, disregard that for a moment. I'll get to the interest rate in just a minute. Line up as much available credit as you can, and optimally, at least 3 months of what you would need to live on in terms of credit reserve. In other words, if you can get a $5,000 limit credit card here and a $10,000 limit credit card there, or a $3,000, whatever you can get, $3,000, $2,000, $1,000, as many as you can line up, and stick in a drawer with a rubber band. Activate them and then stick them in a drawer. They're not going to hurt your credit. In fact, they're going to help your credit, because if you have available credit that you do not use, that looks good on your credit reports and will raise your score. Okay? So get as many. If you get an offer in the mail for a credit card, you're pre-approved, take it. Don't cut it up. I know this is 180 degrees the opposite of what standard wisdom is. But what this will do is much more quickly than, you see, if you try to save money, and most of us don't save money, but let's say that somehow you can follow Ben Franklin's advice and save 10% of your income, out of every paycheck. Well, is that 10% of take home, or is that 10% of what you make gross? Because remember, the government's taking out all kinds of stuff too. But so let's pretend that you can save, just to use round numbers, let's say that you make $4,000 a month and you can save $400 a month. Well, it's going to take you 10 months to save up $4,000, which is 1 month of your income. So therefore, it's going to take 30 months to save up $12,000, which is 3 months of your income. 3 times 10 is 30. That's where I got that. So, and that's optimally if no emergencies come up and no needing new tires, no hole in the roof of your house, no unforeseen emergencies where you might need that cash otherwise. That's going to make it much longer than 30 months to save it. And the disaster that's coming could come anytime in the next 1 to 3 years by my calculations. Therefore, you may not have 30 months to save up. Even if you start right now at saving 10% of your income, you may not have 30 months to do it. So reason number one for building up your available credit is you want to get as much cash available to you as possible, where you don't have to wait for government checks to come or wait for the government to come to bat. And you want to get it lined up now. Again, don't use it. I'm not telling you to run up your credit cards. This is not my advice. My advice is to get credit cards and to get credit lines. Get as many Visas and MasterCards and Discovers, especially ones that afford you cash advance. Get as many as you possibly can. Fuck, what the rewards are. Don't worry about the frequent flyer miles. None of that's going to mean shit in an economic collapse. Just get as many available credit cards as you possibly can. And optimally, if you have good credit, and if you have equity, things to lean against, go down to the bank or the credit union. Credit unions often have better deals. I belong to Navy Federal myself as a Navy veteran, and you don't have to be a Navy veteran. You just have to be a veteran to belong to Navy Federal. Great credit union, by the way, and I have no commercial relationship with them. But anyway, go down and line up a credit line as much as they will give you. Just don't use it. Just have it reserved. And then instead of waiting for 30 months and maybe 40, 50, or 60 months to get your and we don't have 60 months to play with here, friends, you will have your 90 days of on-hand cash reserve available to you now, okay? That's reason number one for doing it with expanded credit. Reason number two for doing it with expanded credit is in the event of a hyperinflation. And what I mean by hyperinflation is double digits. Inflation is the friend of a borrower. So in the extreme example, looking at what's going on today in Venezuela, and that's an extreme example. I don't expect our inflation to get as bad as Venezuela's, but I expect it to get pretty bad. Venezuela's inflation is running at 10 million%. So that means if you borrowed money today, okay, at the worst credit card rate that the law allows, which is 29.8%. So let's call it 30%. You're borrowing money at 30%. Well, if you have an annual inflation running at 10 million%, that means you can pay back that money later for less than it was worth on the day that you borrowed it. In other words, inflation is the friend of the borrower. That's why the government, by the way, builds inflation into the economic model through the Federal Reserve, and that's how they plan to handle the national debt, cheapening it with inflation. But you can play this game, and in a hyperinflation, it really works to your advantage because the government won't react to allow interest rates to rise to compensate for inflation as quickly as the inflation takes place. So let's say hypothetically, in the hypothetical example, and I know I might be losing you, so I'm going to try to slow it down a little bit. Let's say that you make that $4,000 a month, and let's say that you line up $12,000 worth of credit, okay? And let's say the shit hits the fan, hyperinflation kicks in, inflation is running at 50%, and that I do expect, okay? Maybe even 100% inflation. And you have all of this money at 30%, and you borrow it. You go out and you take your cash advances, and you get your $12,000. Well, when you go to pay back the $12,000 a year from now at 100% inflation, it's going to be worth a lot less than $12,000 today. Do you get it? $12,000 at 100% inflation halves the value of money. Okay, so you're paying it back with much cheaper dollars, and the more inflation accelerates, the more it works to your advantage. And the interest they're charging, 30%, does not offset the 100% inflation. And I know this all sounds dramatic, but let's go back to what Paul Singer says. He's agreeing with me, we're risking a hyperinflation by printing all this money. Inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. Now, there are people out there that will tell you that you can't have an inflation in a depression, and we have a much greater risk of depression currently than we do inflation. But they don't remember the 1970s and stagflation, where you can have both, a stagnant economy and a hyperinflation at the same time, or an inflation at the same time. It wasn't a hyperinflation. It was inflation, but it wasn't as bad as hyperinflation, thank God. But we're about to have both. We're going to have a hyper-depression. That's my term for it. We are staring down the barrel at a hyper-depression, where we're going to have dramatically reduced economic activity together with a hyperinflation. And it's going to shake our very society to its roots. And I'll be spending my time, hopefully with you, spreading antipolitism as an alternative, because democracy is going to have a hard time surviving a hyper-depression. We're looking at the great crisis of the 21st century. And the pandemic itself is not what's causing it. It's the fallout from the pandemic that's going to cause it. And all this money being printed, it's going to cause a cascading effect. But anyway, I've discussed that in my COVIDnomics podcast, which is available to you audibly on all the websites to listen to, and you should as quickly as you possibly can. Okay, that's on the Radical Reset audio podcast, COVIDnomics. You want to listen to it? I go into all the reasons why this is going to happen. It's going to happen. I'm telling you, this is... It's the only question is when. Is it going to happen in the next 3 weeks or the next 3 years? Sometime during the next 3 years, we're going to have a hyper-depression, and you need to prepare for it now. And step one is line up as much credit as you possibly can, even more than 90 days of your income if you can, and have it available. Again, don't use it. I'm not counseling if I'm wrong, the worst thing that happens is you cut up the credit cards and forget about it later, okay? Worst case scenario, if I'm wrong under this scenario, you throw them all away. But if I'm right, it's going to be the difference between starvation and survival. So step one, get as much available credit. Okay. Step two, with as much available cash as you possibly can, including money that you now have in 401ks or other places, okay, in or out of an IRA, in or out of a 401k, savings that you have in the bank, begin buying cryptocurrencies. Now, when I say cryptocurrencies, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, that's Bitcoin, Ethereum, Link, Zcash. There are any number of cryptocurrencies, not all Bitcoin. You want to diversify your portfolio into various cryptocurrencies, and you can do that using, for example, a crypto wallet like Coinbase, which is what I use. Again, I have no commercial relationship with Coinbase, and there are other places to invest in cryptocurrency, but to make a long story short is the downside of cryptocurrencies, which are non-governmental currencies created on the internet that have limited supply. In other words, there are only 21 million Bitcoins available. There are only 21 million Ethereum coins available. That's preset into the system. No matter how hard they mine, 21 million is all they're ever going to get. That means with a limited supply and increasing demand, you're going to have raising prices. Okay, that's all you have to understand about it. You know, gold is precious because there's a limited supply. It's hard to mine. There's only so much of in the world, and gold is the other hedge you can get as well. Gold is fine too, but really, because cryptocurrencies are so liquid, liquid means you can turn them to cash very, very quickly. I strongly, and you can spend them. By the way, increasingly there are places, Bitcoin is the most popular because you can spend it in the most places. But you can spend Ethereum, you can spend Zcash, and you can convert them back to dollars or any other currency very readily and very easily using, for example, Coinbase. But you want to get them because they don't correlate with the stock market or the bond market or any other market for that matter. And as the world becomes increasingly distrustful of fiat currency. Today I read in the Wall Street Journal a competing article with the one that Paul Singer said. And you know, opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. And there's a school of thought called modern monetary theory that says as long as a country is in control of its own currency, it doesn't have to fear inflation and can pretty much print up as much money as it needs through its version of the Federal Reserve. Not all countries have a Federal Reserve. They have national banks, you know, like the Bank of England. As long as, for example, England is another country that has control of its own currency. As long as they can print pounds up, let's use pounds as an example. As long as they can print pounds up, and lend them from the Bank of England to the central government in return for notes back and forth, and therefore balance the books, then it's all okay and you can do as much of that as you can. Well, that's just bullshit, friends. I mean, that is modern monetary theory, but what that really is hubris, venality, and political cowardice. No one wants to make the decisions, the hard decisions that have to be made about cutting spending and cutting back the reach of government and coming to a new understanding of what government is there to do, which is to protect you and protect your freedoms and little else. But now government is much more than that. It's there to, in most countries, try to provide happiness, which it does really, really badly. The government only does two things well. That is, write checks and destroy things. War, you know, defense. That's what I mean by destroy things. That's all it does well, okay? And really, currently, it's doing the writing of checks very, very badly. So really, all it really does well is destroy things. Because in the writing of all these checks that they're sending out, they are setting up the destruction of our entire culture. And I know how dramatic that sounds, but this is what we are facing. Every century has its great disaster. The 20th century had World War I, and then World War II, which was an extension of World War I, and the Great Depression in between, and Vietnam and Korea, and, you know, the AIDS pandemic or epidemic, call it what you want. We had lots and lots of horrible things happen. In this century, all we've had is 9/11, which is 3,000 dead people in New York City, which is horrible, but it doesn't begin to equate with what went on in the 20th century. And if you think history has come to an end and we're not going to get our dose of something horrible in this century, you're living on another planet. There is no century in which any country, particularly any great country, gets through 100 years of peace and quiet, okay, with nothing happening. We are not so sophisticated that we are not capable of making horrendous mistakes. And usually the people like me who are telling you what's coming are ignored, okay? And later we end up in charge. You know, I have every expectation that anti-politism is going to end up being the only alternative available, and we're going to end up saving the day at the very last minute. But the pain to get there is going to be so devastating. You know, I don't want to be the one that tells you I told you so. I'm making this video to tell you how to join me now and to prepare yourself in a way that won't hurt you if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, if I turn out to be the biggest nutcase that ever lived, everything I'm telling you to do, lining up your credit in advance but don't use it, just get it ready to use. Buy cryptocurrencies. Look, cryptocurrencies are volatile. They go up and down a lot. Don't be frightened when Bitcoin can go up and down 50%, okay? So can Ethereum, so can Link, so can Zcash, so can the rest. There are tons of cryptocurrencies, and there are lots of good books available to you. Many of them, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can download free on your reading device, you know, whether it's your smartphone or whether it's a Kindle. I like to read on a Kindle because it doesn't hurt my eyes. But anyway, to make a long story short, that you can read up on crypto. I'm not here to give you a course on cryptocurrency. Those are the ones that I mentioned are the ones that I personally diversify into. And you can buy them, there's no minimums. You can buy them $5 and $10 at a time. But as quickly as you can accumulate cryptocurrency, you should, because it's going to be another layer of protection to you, another layer of available capital. Because ultimately what will happen in a hyperinflation is the dollar will collapse. Okay, the government will collapse. And then in the end, they'll call all the dollars back in and issue a new currency, probably a crypto dollar of some sort. In A Radical Reset, the book that I wrote that is the Manifesto of Antipolitism, which is free to you to download through the Kindle Lending Library or available to you very reasonably in paperback. Get your copy. I talk about what should be done to restructure the dollar going forward. But that's what will happen. Ultimately, in the end, when all the shit hits the fan and all the carnage is wrought and people have suffered and died as a result of this, because the number one cause of death in the world, my friends, is poverty. And we are going to drive millions and millions of people into poverty, which causes all kinds of side effects. And when the smoke clears from all of this, and when a new government emerges and a new system emerges, there's going to be a new currency. And if you have cryptocurrency on hand, and by the way, as soon as the shit starts hitting the fan, when it becomes evident, and I'll tell you when that is, by the way, when it's obvious, then you're going to draw on your credit reserves and buy more cryptocurrency as much as you possibly can. Because when the shit hits the fan, okay, not an if, a when, and they issue the new currency and they clean it out and we restructure everything and government goes back to doing what it should be doing, and you can have confidence in the currency that's being issued, then you can convert your cryptocurrency back and be the richest guy in town. Okay, do you follow what I'm saying? And in the meantime, while all this shit's happening and people are looking to there will be a black market, there will be available goods. Just like today, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, you can buy toilet paper if you can pay for it. Okay, basically. Well, the same thing is going to be true in spades in the event of a hyperinflation and a collapse. Even in Venezuela today, there are goods available as long as you have US dollars. The problem is the Venezuelan peso, or is it a peso or a peseta? I forget. I think it's a peso. You can wipe your ass with it, okay? It's toilet paper. Toilet paper, in fact, it's cheaper to wipe your ass with their currency than with, and this is what happens. It gets away from the governments because they commit themselves to all these entitlement spending programs that they can't stop, and they don't have the money to do it. And the economy starts melting down, which means tax collections start melting down, and there's no political courage to make the cuts that are necessary, so they continue to print money. The money goes into circulation, and that's what we're doing today. Okay, right now we're borrowing 40% of our budget. We're printing out of thin air through the Federal Reserve. Okay, let's be fair, 40%. Of course, that depends on whose accounting you believe, and I don't necessarily, the way they account on the books and off the books, let's not get into that today. But by the way, another article that was in today's newspaper is Social Security, years ahead of time, has run out of money. Okay, and we're now having to borrow to cover our Social Security payments, which was supposed to be a few years away under the current calculation. But nope, it's here today. We are now borrowing, and that's done off budget, so God only knows how much money we're talking about. We're now borrowing to cover Social Security payments to old people like me. Okay, so look guys, this is a recipe for disaster. This is not going to end well. So, to review again, step one, you're going to build up your credit assets as much as you possibly can. Step two, you're going to buy cryptocurrency as much as you possibly can. Now we're going to come to step three. Step three is going to sound, to some people, not to those of us who are rational, a little nutty. The people who it's especially going to sound rational to are my friends who are a member of the LDS Mormon religion. Now, let me preface. I was born Jewish. I am Jewish. I am a proud Jewish man. But I like to say I am Jewish because I don't actually believe in God. I'm agnostic. So while I'm extremely proud of my heritage, I don't practice the religion. Now that I got that out, and I only bring this up for one reason, is I'm not a Mormon. Yet I have enormous respect for the Mormon religion, and one of the things, and I respect it for lots of reasons. I respect the enormously great family values. I respect the more than just urging, the demand that people live a virtuous life. The patriotism of the LDS are amazing. And I live in Arizona, which has a large LDS population. LDS, by the way, for those of you who live in New York City and don't understand that, is Latter-day Saints. Mormons and LDS is a synonymous term. I just like to use LDS. I live in a state, Arizona, which borders on the headquarters of the Mormon Church, which is Utah, Salt Lake City. That's where the big tabernacle is. Although we have a tabernacle here in Phoenix on the east side. It's a smaller version of the big one that's built in Salt Lake City. And if you've ever been to Salt Lake, it's a beautiful city, and that's the Jerusalem of Mormonism. And by the way, folks in the LDS, if I got that wrong, feel free to write me a letter, and I know you'll be respectful because every Mormon I've ever met has been delightful. Anyway, to make a long story short, the Mormons, I'm not going to get into the liturgy and what they believe and don't believe, and I have lots of people who consider themselves Christians who don't think Mormons are Christians and think they're a cult, and I've heard this all a million times. I don't want to have that discussion. I don't want to get into people's religions. I don't want to argue about who has the best invisible friend and how they believe in them. I don't want to get into that at all. Okay, what I want to talk about is how Mormons prepare for disaster. One of the smart things they've done for years and years and years is keep enormous amounts of food and supplies on hand. And I have to believe that in Utah today, when the supply chain got disrupted and toilet paper and things like that were not available, the best prepared people in America have to be the LDS, because they're always ready for this. They have food and supplies on hand, water, toilet paper, paper towels, and food, freeze-dried and canned, in reserve in their homes, as directed by their church, as I understand it, all the time. Not only do they tithe 10% of their income to the church to prepare for a bad day, and they all help each other out, which is awesome, but they keep this reserve, they're required to keep this reserve in their homes. And there are lots of companies that provide this stuff. You can go on Amazon. The easiest way I found to do it is you go on Amazon and just look under long-term food storage, long-term food supplies, food storage, use the search term you want, and lots of companies will pop up, and there's lots of ratings of these companies, and you just want to try this food yourself as to which one, because most of it is actually pretty good. And what you do is, if you don't use it, you'll just eat it later. Look, here's what I suggest you do. If this pandemic hasn't taught us anything, it's that how quickly a supply chain can be disrupted over very little. This pandemic, I don't want to argue with you over how deadly COVID-19 is, but you got to admit, based on the early modeling, it is far less deadly and far less damaging than anyone thought it was going to be. And the whole world shut down over it. And this is not a podcast on whether that was smart or stupid, but look, guys, look how the supply chains of vital things, from paper products to cleaning supplies, were disrupted. Bam, cut off, done, finished. Almost overnight, in a panic over a virus that turned out to have a fatality rate, it looks like, of about 0.3%, okay, which is less than the flu. Now, imagine that we go into a hyperinflation, a hyperdepression like the one I'm talking about. Imagine that Paul Singer's risk profile in the article that I read to you from the Wall Street Journal is correct. Imagine that we are right just for a moment. Imagine how fast the supply chains will break down. And you need to have on hand for yourself and your family at least 90 days while the world gets itself in order. At least 90 days, and maybe up to a year's worth of food and supplies, which, by the way, are relatively cheap to do. We're talking hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars. And stored in your home or apartment on shelves, ready to go. And if I'm wrong, just like with the credit cards that you're not going to use unless you have to, just like the cryptocurrency that you can turn to cash if I'm wrong, and the worst thing that happens is that maybe it fluctuates down a little bit, but you're not going to lose all your money, okay? The worst thing that happens if I'm wrong and the world turns out to be a sunny and rosy place and you live into your 80s and this disaster never happens, the worst thing that you do with this food is eat it. And it's not bad. I've had it. It's pretty good. It's at least as good as Chef Boyardee, and in many cases, much, much better. No knock on Chef Boyardee. It's just that after childhood and growing up in an Irish Catholic suburb of Pittsburgh, I saw enough SpaghettiOs to last me a lifetime, and I really have no. Did they make the Chef Boyardee make spaghetti? Oh, okay, whoever. But anyway, it's certainly better than that. In fact, in many cases, much better than that. Store in supplies. I know that if you're living in New York City and listening to me right now, you're saying to yourself, my neighbors will think I am out of my fucking mind. And I know that if you're a traditional thinker, you're thinking to yourself right now, he's out of his fucking mind. But just look at toilet paper. That's all I have to say. There really is no shortage of toilet paper, okay? What we have is a breakdown of the supply chain. There's no shortage of paper towels. There's no shortage of cleaning products. What there is a breakdown in the supply chain. Now imagine a hyper-depression. Everything will break down. You won't be able, and by the way, I keep saying toilet paper and paper towels, but for example, I shop at sometimes Trader Joe's and sometimes Whole Foods and sometimes Sprouts Market. And I gotta tell you, getting beans, one of the things I like to make, because I'm a single man, I have an Instant Pot pressure cooker, and I like to make beans. I like to make pinto beans with ham, and I like to make, navy bean soup and things like that. Dried beans are in short supply, okay? So it's not just cleaning supplies. It's hard to get a lot of things that you want, and it's hard to get a lot of brands that you want. And the reason for that is the breakdown in the supply chain caused by a relatively mild pandemic. I mean, this was not the Ebola virus, thank God. But if I'm right, and there's a hyperdepression, and even if there's something else that comes up that we haven't thought of yet, like a pandemic of something like Ebola, some horrible fucking thing where people are vomiting blood and it's killing children and people are freaking the fuck out, it is a good idea to emulate the LDS and emulate the Mormons and stock in at least 3 months, preferably 6 months, and ideally a year, depending upon your financial situation, of foodstuffs in your home on shelves. This stuff stores without refrigeration. You can get canned water that stays good for years. Stock it in, stock it up on your shelves. Go on Amazon, you can find these suppliers. It's easy, or Google it. There's a lot of them. They supply the LDS. A lot of them are LDS owned because that's where this all began. And yes, that puts you in league with survivalists and things like that. You know what? Survivalists have a point. Now, let's review the 3 things, that I'm going to come to one fourth point that I'm going to mention in passing, which could be offensive to some, but I'm going to mention it in passing. Step 1, you're going to you're going to line up, that's the right term. You're going to line up as much credit as you possibly can. Step 2, you're going to buy as much cryptocurrency as you possibly can. Step 3, you're going to emulate the LDS and you're going to stock in food for at least 3 months and preferably up to a year in your, and when I say food, I'm not obviously not things that can rot. You're going to use the services. There are companies that provide this. That's the great thing. We still live in at least a crony capitalist system where there is still a free market, and there are still companies that produce this stuff, and it's inexpensive. A 3-month supply of meals is something like $400. Okay, so when you're looking at a whole year supply, you're looking at about $1,600. And I know that sounds like money, but that's not going to sound like anything when the shit hits the fan and you're the one sitting quietly in your home and you have money in cryptocurrency that you know you can spend, and you have food on the shelf so you know you're not going to starve, and you have plenty of access to cash, and everything is great, and you're thinking back to yourself, I'm so glad I listened to that guy that resembled Santa Claus on that podcast, who, by the way, you'll then know my name big time. Suddenly I'll become really popular because I'll be out spreading the only other ism that works, since socialism will be, and fascism, they'll rear their ugly heads in the event of a hyper-depression, but we've got to present the new ism that works, and that's what Antipolitism is, which is why I'm telling you to read the book, A Radical Reset, the link below. Now, the fourth thing I'm going to bring up in this podcast, and then I'm going to wrap up, is guns. Now, I know that, well, in for a dime, in for a dollar. I'm going to tell you the truth. The best personal protection weapon that you can keep in the house in the event of a real meltdown is a shotgun, and the shorter the barrel, the better, okay? And look, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I do not own a gun, okay? I am not a member of the NRA. As far as I know, none of my children own a gun, but I, yesterday on the phone, encouraged them. I was talking to my eldest son, and I said to him, you ought to be thinking strongly about putting a shotgun in your house. Now, why a shotgun? Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with guns, the AR-15 knockoffs look really cool, but you got to know what you're doing to use it and hit a target with it. In the end, it's just a single bullet, and you have to be able to aim that thing. And when you're freaking out because someone's breaking into your house, the odds of being able to aim that thing properly to defend yourself is going to be very difficult. Handguns, even more so. You can be pointing a handgun at somebody who's 10 feet away, and if your hands are shaking, you're going to miss. But if you point the shotgun, particularly a sawed-off shotgun, in the general, I'm talking 12 gauge, in the general direction, okay, of the person breaking in and pull the trigger, you're going to hit them. And unlike the movies in The Terminator, they're not going to get up. You're going to blow them all over the wall, and that's going to be the end of it. Okay, it's, the closer they are, the better, by the way. But you want to just be able, you want a weapon that you can pull up if need be. You don't have to practice how to use. You don't have to go to the range. You don't have to become a crack shot. You don't have to learn to steady your nerves. Someone's breaking into your house trying to get at your food supply during a hyperinflation, depressionary time. Someone is threatening your life. Okay, you're going to thank God you had a shotgun in the house that you pulled out of the closet, pointed it in the general direction, and pulled the fucking trigger. Once they're inside the door, don't worry, a good lawyer will get you off, worst case scenario. But once they're in your house, what are they going to say? Okay? And when you pull that trigger, you want to make sure you hit the motherfucker, and you want to make sure he goes down and he stays down. And that's what a 12-gauge shotgun, sawed off. And if you don't know how to do that or get that done, just talk to guys who run gun stores. There are plenty of them that know what they're doing. I strongly, strongly urge you, okay, to have a personal protection weapon in your house. I know how dark that sounds when I say that, but I really think this is not a time to get into a discussion. And we're not talking about a concealed weapon you carry as you walk down the street. We're not talking about something you drive around with. I'm talking about in your home, okay, you have a shotgun. Because whether you're male or female, tall or short, strong or weak, you can point that thing in the general direction. And the reason of a sawed-off barrel is it creates a greater spread for the pellets. Shotguns fire pellets out of shells, for those of you who aren't familiar, and those pellets spread. That's why they use them for bird hunting, because it's hard to hit a bird with one bullet. They shoot the shotgun and the pellets spread, and then the bird gets hit by the spread in the general direction and it comes down, okay? And I know those of you who are vegans and stuff are hating that idea, and I'm not here to advocate bird hunting, okay? I'm just saying that as a personal protection weapon, when they come through the front, you hear them, scratching on the door and coming through, and you pull that thing out and you're scared. You are fucking frightened, and your hands are shaking, and they're shaking, and you just point that thing at the, and I personally prefer a pump shotgun, so you have more than one shot. A double barrel, you have two shots, and you got to, there's two triggers, and you pull one at a time, or there's a switch, but the easiest thing is the pump, like you hear in the movies, click, click. Nothing scares the shit out of an intruder more than that sound, by the way. And by the way, this isn't the fucking movies. You don't wait for the click, click. You get that thing ready, you point it at the door, they come through the door, you pull the fucking trigger. You don't, worry about halt, halt, halt. If it was a friend of yours, they wouldn't be breaking in, all right? If they had a key, you wouldn't be worried about it. We're talking about someone's breaking into your home to get at your things in a terrible, terrible time. You shoot to put them down, okay? And that's what that does. Okay, I dwelled on that a lot more than I thought I was going to, but I want to make a strong, strong recommendation. This is something that you consider. Because you know what, folks? The time to get it isn't after the attack. I don't know what else to say. And we're facing a dark, dark time. Now look, I'm going to wrap up now. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that modern monetary theory is correct. I hope that we can print money out of thin air as much as we possibly want, and it's all going to work out fine. I hope the economy bounces back from the COVID pandemic like it never happened. I hope everybody gets their job back. I hope the government reins back both their spending and the intrusions in our private lives that are going to continue as a result of this. I hope that democracy survives. I hope we live happily ever after. I hope I die at 120 years old in my sleep and none of this shit ever happens. But I just don't think that's going to happen. And if I'm right, I'm going to save your life and mine and my family's and your families and everybody else that we love. Okay, that's it for today. Enough scare tactics. And pardon me, a little something caught in my teeth. I'm going to take a little sip here. I'd had breakfast just before I did this. Good coffee. Okay, so look, gang, here's the deal. Pick up a copy of A Radical Reset. The free link is below. Go on Amazon, get the book and read it. It's the system and all the solutions to all the problems that we face in a way that, could happen if we weren't dealing with the corruption of our modern political system. Meanwhile, have a happy life. Soon this pandemic will be over. Soon we'll all be on the streets, but you want to prepare for the next one, okay? Take my advice, live happily ever after, and join the anti-political movement. Thanks very much. And until next time, this is E.H. Ivins signing off.